I feel Rosalind being played by me, a man, I think it does change it. It adds another layer of gender confusion in the sense that Rosalind, a woman, is pretending to be a man, standing in as Rosalind for her lover Orlando, and then I'm a man. So I think for me it was sort of to just sort of play it androgynously in a way, kind of sort of take sort of bits and pieces of what is considered male and female, whatever that means. Because I think what Shakespeare's trying to say with As You Like It is that gender is a construct. I think he was kind of ahead of his time in the way that he sort of ridicules masculinity in this monologue.
Yeah, it definitely does change the meaning. As I said in my original video, this speech isn't specifically about female experience. It's not like Lady Macbeth talking about being a mother, but it being performed by a woman definitely does have implications for how we read it, and so it being performed by a man definitely does as well.
Rosalind portrays lots of characteristics such as her quick thinking and her decisiveness. It shows that that's kind of that would be seen as a male trait, but she is sort of the best wielder of those characteristics in the play. So I think it's very much sort of when it came to sort of deciding sort of the posture and the voice to sort of incorporate those sort of things that Rosalind's like the high posture and sort of the eloquent way of speaking that she probably would have had when she was in court, but obviously she's trying to mask that. So there was keeping that in there a bit, but then also trying not to make it sort of stereotypically female or male, because I think it just is a disservice to Shakespeare's writing and his vision for the play. And just, I think, bring out Rosalind's strength of character, but also her vulnerability. I think those are sort of the key driving elements of the scene and her personality.
Something that I did when working on the monologue is I kind of took it out of context of the play, because Portia is a character that I think gender does matter to the character. So I took it out of context of the play, still kept it in the situation, so of the scene and everything that happens around the monologue, still looked at that and kept that. But I kind of stripped away the gender and a bit of the character because I thought it was important in getting the message across and getting the story across, and I looked at it that way with the monologue rather than focusing on the gender because I didn't think that was a really important thing to do.
I don't think that it does particularly. I think that gender doesn't really it's not a huge part of this monologue, which essentially to me boiled down to an expression of dawning grief and then real vulnerability and a sense of restraint and residual duty, and then ultimately a sort of sentiment of hope that, you know, this is the parting of Ferdinand and the princess, but hopefully they can both sort of perform their duties, the princess to herself and her father, and Ferdinand to his own word, to restore his integrity, which are, you know, these are feelings that we can all relate to.
No, I don't think that playing Isabel as a man changes the meaning. If you think about the character of Isabel being a kind of a morally strict, principled character that at some point has to betray her principles or his principles, that doesn't matter. So that's a kind of universal thing, a situation that everybody can face. So the meaning stays the same, and that's what I try to remind myself of, I think. So trying to abstract from gender and thinking of the specific situation that the character is in.
I think it probably would be an important thing if you were looking at the play as a whole. I think gender and status come in a lot with Shakespeare, so that's definitely something that you would be looking at with Portia. But for me, taking it out of context and looking more at the narrative was quite an important thing.
To be honest with you, doing this project as a whole is asks a lot of questions about, you know, what men and women should be performing. I do feel a certain amount of not guilt. Guilt is the wrong word, but I do feel unqualified to speak about a lot of this stuff as a white straight man aged 21. I'm kind of not an unrepresented group in any stretch of the imagination, and it feels like I don't really have the right to be adding my voice to the conversation. So I think it kind of has exposed that, which I think is useful. It's a useful thing to think about and talk about.
Yes, the changing the gender does affect the dynamic, I think, especially with Angelo, a male character who tries to dominate, intimidate Isabel. But it could work. I cannot off the top of my head think of how the dynamic would change. It really depends on the actors. But that would be interesting to see.
The power dynamics, I think, won't change particularly. Power is a really interesting thing in this play, I think. And it's fairly evenly distributed as well. It's yes and no, really. I think that there would be a change which we couldn't have shown to you through the monologue. Because I think that the monologue itself, because it's on such a small scale and it takes that character in isolation, you know, I'm not responding to anyone, it's just me and that character. I don't think it will affect power dynamics, but it may affect the general sort of scene-to-scene composition. And that will, I think, be more prominent on a larger scale than on a macro sort of monologue level.
I think it does matter with Portia. I think a lot of the things that happen in her life and a lot of her storyline happen because she is a woman. I think that is a really interesting thing to play around with when you're swapping the gender of the character. It's definitely something that you would have to make a lot of informed and educated choices on in regards to The Merchant of Venice, because it is about religion and it is about that part of history, and I think it very much does belong to the time that it was written in, which is maybe why we don't see a lot of modern adaptations of it.
The big change, I guess, is the relationship or implied relationship with Hamlet becoming homosexual rather than heterosexual. But there's nothing in the play that stops that. It's purely not written like that. It doesn't break the play by that happening. It has implications for the family dynamics with Ophelia and Polonius and Laertes. Polonius is this kind of quite controlling father. Laertes is able to escape that as a little bit as a man. Ophelia not so much. So maybe that works less. But I mean, there are, in terms of it being, you know, reflective of a 17th century society, maybe that works slightly less. But it's not. Again, it doesn't break the play at all.
I think the most obvious gender dynamic shift in this scene, with me playing Rosalind as a man, is doubling down on the homosexual subtext, with Rosalind kind of indirectly proposing marriage to Orlando, and so it's something I've related to, having been in the closet and as a gay man. So it's something I really like playing into and found something that was nice to invest in the scene. I think Shakespeare was showing that Rosalind as a woman has so much power, more power than any of the male characters in the play. But I think maybe now, with me playing it as a man, me playing a woman as a man who's in male disguise as Ganymede, but then Ganymede assumes the role of Rosalind, there is so much gender play that perhaps maybe the meaning shifts, that this sort of logic and these problem-solving abilities aren't inherent to gender and just the individual, and that Rosalind is just a very capable person, male or female.
I've never seen the character of Portia being played by a man because I've only seen the play once. I saw The Merchant of Venice when it was at the Globe a couple of years ago, and it was kind of a very traditional portrayal of the story. It was one of the plays that I'm not too familiar with, so it was interesting to go back to it and explore it a little bit more.
I haven't. I'm sure it has been done because it could be done quite easily. Having a homosexual relationship in there would be quite an interesting interpretation of the play. Ophelia's kind of mental health issues towards the end of it, I think, would be interesting done by a man, especially with the fact that men's mental health is still a bit of a stigmatised conversation.
I've not seen Isabel being played by a man before, so I think I've seen more traditional Shakespearean productions, so that may explain it. But the reason why Isabel specifically is not played by a man has possibly to do with this kind of, well, you think about Shakespearean times, especially the dynamic with Angelo, the male character, that seems to be kind of female-male specific. So I can imagine why, thinking especially about the Shakespearean context, that seems it's harder to imagine that being played by a man.
I think I've just never seen it done because I've not seen that many Hamlets more than anything, because I think it could be done quite easily. But I do think there's a tendency when doing Shakespeare to stick to what Shakespeare has written and not to play with it too much, which some people manage to break away from slightly, but I think it is it's always better for that. Shakespeare is better for breaking the mold a little bit.
Have I ever seen my character played by a man? No, I've not. I've only ever seen Love's Labour's Lost once. It was very good, mind you. But yeah, that was all cast as you sort of, well, as is written. So no, I've never seen the Princess of France played by a man. Unless I watch back this footage, I guess.
I have. I think one of the most interesting ones I've seen is Harriet Walter as Prospero in The Tempest, which is part of an all-female Shakespeare trilogy that was done at the Donmar in the early 2010s, I think it was. They did Tempest, Julius Caesar, and one other, Henry IV, I think. And it was I think it worked really, really well. There's a terrible film with Helen Mirren as Prospera, not Prospero, which isn't terrible because of the gender swapping, but is just terrible anyway. I think actually that aspect of it does work quite well in that film. But in the Harriet Walter Tempest, that works really well because it's not overly done. It's not. They don't try and I don't know. It's not the headline of it. I guess it's quite subtle, which I think is the best way to do this kind of thing because it just feels normal. It doesn't feel like it's not made to feel different or weird or any kind of other that Prospero is a woman. It's just part of the facts of the play, which I think is the most successful way to do that. Because it forces the audience, means the audience don't think about it, and because they don't think about it, then they do think about it, which is quite an interesting thing. It makes you kind of confront that, as an audience member, it makes you confront that expectation.
I have not seen a female-male gender swap on stage in a Shakespeare play before, but I'm not the biggest expert here.
My memory's been tested a bit here. I can't really think. I was supposed to play one of the witches, one of the three witches in Macbeth. I didn't actually get round to doing that. That was in a Troubadour production. So the people editing know about this, haha. But I think it would have been interesting, because I think with the witches of creatures that, not of this world, of human species, I think they're probably less concerned with that sort of human construct of gender.
I've seen a lot of Shakespeare gender play. That's a weird sentence. I'm going to change that. Have you ever seen swap on stage? Yeah. I've seen a lot of gender swaps on stage in Shakespeare. I think there's two ways to do it. One is to play the character in the gender that it is written, and just have an actor of the opposite gender playing that character. And the other choice is to change the gender of the character. I've seen both. I think both are really interesting, and you can really play around with both.
I've seen, I think, the most memorable gender swap would be Twelfth Night. I think the 2012 version at the Globe with Mark Rylance and Stephen Fry, where the entire cast, well, it's an all male cast, playing all of the roles, which is fantastic.
One of the most effective ways that I've seen, I think, was at the Globe a couple of years ago, and it was Emma Rice's A Midsummer Night's Dream, and they changed the role of Helena to be a boy, and it was a homosexual man, and it just made that love square. Is it a love square? I guess it is. But it made that love square really interesting because it added an extra layer, and it really brought it into the 21st century and brought it into our modern world. I'm a huge believer that theatre should be portraying the streets that we live on and the world that we live in. And I think a lot of the time swapping genders and playing around with that can really help do that. I think another really effective way of changing gender in stories was done in the West End production A Company that we saw very recently. And there was a lot of gender swaps in that. The lead character of Bobby was changed from a man to a woman, and there was quite a few other roles in it that were switched. It just brought a whole new dynamic to the piece, and it really brought it into modern day and the modern day issues that we face, the inequality in genders that we still have, the homophobia in the world, and all of this can be brought into a piece by changing some genders. I think you just have to do it educatedly.
I think if I did have to see a female character played by a man, I'd love to see Juliet played by a man. I'm just really gunning. I'm really rooting for a gay Romeo and Juliet. Romeo and Jack. That wouldn't sell. It really wouldn't sell. But, you know, with a better name, maybe. It would just sort of be revolutionary for the time period, and I'd really invest in it. I think a lot of gay audiences maybe who aren't into Shakespeare as much might be drawn to the play and widen the audience and the discussion.
Oh, there's quite a few parts. I'd love to play Juliet. I think Juliet could be a really interesting thing to gender swap. I think it's been done before, but I've not seen it. And I'd love to play Juliet. I think that could be really fun. I actually think a male and a male, Romeo and Juliet, two men playing those two roles could be really interesting. Or two women playing those roles, I think that could also be quite interesting. Again, I think it's playing with that gender stereotype, because Juliet is written as more of a feminine woman, and Romeo is written more as a masculine man, so I think playing with that gender dynamic could be quite interesting.
I think it would be interesting to see more of Ophelia or Juliet being played by a man off the top of my head. Also interesting in terms of changing the dynamics with other characters in that play.
I would love to see a gender swap Macbeth. So a female Macbeth and a male Lady Macbeth. Lady Macbeth as a female is so cool. She's crazy, but she's cool. But I think changing that gender in that relationship could be really interesting. And I think it could almost be quite frightening to have a male kind of overpower a woman like that, as Lady Macbeth does to Macbeth, and kind of controls him slightly. I think that could be a really frightening thing to see on stage, and I think that's a dynamic that could work. I don't know.
I think Lady Macbeth as a man would be really interesting. There are things that would have to be changed. As I said, the stuff about motherhood wouldn't work. So much of the way we've kind of read Lady Macbeth and the way that we've accepted her interpretation, the interpretation of that character is so much about her being female. I think turning that on its head would be really interesting, and a really interesting exposure of why we have adopted that interpretation and what we read into it because of that.
There are so many characters, I think, in Shakespeare that I would love to see. What I love about so many female Shakespeare characters is they're really strong women. Some of them are a little bit messed up, obviously, but they're really strong women, like Lady Macbeth. A Winter's Tale, one of my favourite Shakespeare plays. You've got Paulina and Hermione, both very strong women, but in very different ways. And I think those are definitely parts that we should, at this point in time, be keeping as female, because I think it's empowering to women, and to see those kind of parts being played, I think is incredibly empowering, and we should be empowering our women because women are amazing.
I think, yeah, absolutely. I think that with each new actor who tries this role, we get a new perspective and a new take on a character. With each actor that takes on this role, we get a new perspective on a character, and so the more the merrier in that sense. That sure, some may work more than others, but I think that it's really interesting to explore that anyway.
I think people should be writing new plays with better female characters than Shakespeare does. I think there are a lot of other plays that do much better at women characters than Shakespeare does, and I think maybe those should be performed instead.
I'd love to see some more gender swapping in Shakespeare. I mean, it would really sort of change the context of a lot of plays. A gay Romeo and Juliet, I mean, it really kind of heightens that sort of forbidden love theme in the play and would be unconventional for sort of the time period. I'd love to see it.
I think that plays, theatre production should be creative, innovative, and a gender swap could definitely be a part of that.
If people do want to do Shakespeare, I think there is nothing wrong with the gender swap at all, as long as it is justified in the play, and as long as it doesn't break the rules of the play. That's not to say they're Shakespeare's rules. I think as a creative team you can create new rules, as long as it doesn't break those rules that you have adopted or created, then absolutely go for it. I think a lot of the times plays are more interesting because of it.
I definitely think gender should be played with more in theatre. I think in a lot of cases it wouldn't work. But I think if you've got a great director and a good actor, I think you can really make very well educated choices. And a lot of the ways that I've seen it done before really bring that piece into our modern world and give it new storylines and new layers. And I think if it can enhance a piece, then absolutely we should be playing around with that and experimenting. If it brings up too many questions, we should be looking at why is it bringing up so many questions. What is it about that part that must be female? What is it about that part that must be male? I think especially in our modern day world, gender is becoming a much more fluid thing, and it's becoming less stereotypical, you know, pink is not just for girls and blue is just not for boys. All those silly things that come with gender are kind of slowly fading away, which I think is a really wonderful way to live. I think it's such a freeing movement for so many people. And I think we should be applying that to theatre. We should be kind of breaking down these gender stereotypes and seeing why that gender matters in that character. I think that is a huge question that we should be asking ourselves. What does that gender contribute to that character?
I think there are some roles that should sort of stick as their gender. I think Lady Macbeth should always be a woman. I don't know why, but it's just such an interesting female part. I think it's... I can't really explain it. But then who wouldn't maybe want to see a Lady Macbeth and a woman playing Macbeth? That might be interesting. I think it just opens up a lot of avenues for exploration and development. You know, these plays have been going for hundreds and hundreds of years, and the things that experimentation with time period and setting can do really just recontextualises Shakespeare's amazing writing. There's so much that can be explored, and I think gender is explored a lot in Shakespeare's plays, and it just adds a new conversation to it, and I think that's how we keep audiences coming back.